Hello and good night to everyone. Thank you for joining another episode of Island Learning Grenada Sundays. Today is the last Sunday in February, and we're just wrapping up the month of February. So all the independence celebrations so far would have been completed in Grenada and also in the diaspora. So today, I'm the host again. My name is Crystal Simeon. I'm the owner of Island Learning Grenada. Welcome to all the new followers who are viewing the program for the very first time. If you are returning to the program, it's nice to have you back for another episode of Island Learning Grenada. It's going to be an exciting show today. We have a guest on, and I'll bring him on shortly, but just a couple things before we get to that. So if you are watching via Facebook, please share the program. Hit the share button and share the program. Most importantly, so hit share right now and share the program. If you are watching via YouTube, ensure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel, Island Learning Grenada. So hit subscribe to the YouTube channel. So that's the two things. Most important things that you do today, you hit share so that you share the program so that we can reach our broader audience. Whenever you share the program, your friends on your Facebook page also see the program. And also, if you're on YouTube, it's nice to stay connected to our content. So make sure you hit subscribe button and subscribe to the content, right? So we're going to do our intro video as we always do typically, and then we'll be right back after the intro. So share the program and get ready for the episode today. We'll be right back. So welcome back to another episode of Island Learning Grenada. I see I have my guests here, so we're not going to stick today on the program. I hope that you hit the share button and that you would have shared the live so that we can reach our broader audience. Or if you're watching via YouTube, you have subscribed to our channel, Island Learning Grenada. So at Island Learning Grenada, we're all about educating on Grenada's history, heritage, and culture. And as part of that, ever so often we'll have a guest on who can provide even more information than I can, right? So some of the experts say in the historical or heritage or cultural areas as needed. So today we have a guest. I'm so excited to have my guest today. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the guest and then I'm going to bring him on. So the guest for today is Dr. Jonathan Hanna. And he is an anthropological archaeologist who completed his undergraduate degree in anthropology from Montclair State University in New Jersey, where he's originally from. He worked in contract archaeology in the US and at the American Museum of Natural History in New York before coming to Grenada as a member of the US Peace Corps as a volunteer, where he would have taught for some time at the St. George's Methodist School. He later went on to complete his master's degree in anthropology, and also he has a doctorate, his doctoral dissertation on the pre-Columbian archaeology of Grenada at Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Hanna has served as an adjunct professor at Penn State University and Cookwood Community College, and as a curator at the Grenada National Museum right here in St. George's, Grenada. His research focuses on community archaeology in Grenada, past human-environmental interactions, and conservation and heritage policy. He has done a lot of work in the area of Grenada's archaeological heritage, and his most recent work was on the archaeological background of Sutter's Bay, that's in St. Patrick's, Grenada, which was published in December by the Grenada National Museum Press. So today we have Dr. Jonathan Hanna. I'm going to bring him on, and he's an archaeologist, and we'll be talking about the archaeology in Grenada and some of the insights that he has to share with us. Hello, Jonathan. Nice to have you on.
Hi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Yes, I'm super excited. Yes, and yes, thank you for sending the introduction. So I'm very excited to have you on the program here today because we're all about educating those who view the program, both in Grenada and in the Grenada diaspora, about Grenada's history, heritage, and culture. And you're in a very unique spot because you focus on archaeology of Grenada, which is something not a lot of people know about, right? They probably only heard that there's archaeology, and Grenada probably has some unique elements there, but that whole area is widely unknown, right? So it's a great opportunity to share that knowledge with others, with Grenadians who are viewing the program and others to learn more about what are some of the archaeology in terms of Grenada. We are on an island, we know we're volcanic, etc. But I think there's probably lots more than that.
Yeah. There's a lot more, and it's only scratched the surface. I mean, what I can present today is just the little that we know now, but there's so much more. So getting the message out to encourage people to study this, that this is something you can study and you could do this, and there is an increasing need, I think, in Grenada for it. So, yeah.
And on that point, before we get into the presentation, what first drew you into that career of anthropology and archaeology? It's not something that, a career path that is often known. So what drew your interest in that area?
It's like movies and stuff when I was little, I guess. I don't know, Indiana Jones and all, I loved those movies. So, archaeology isn't really that, but it is something I think that got me interested.
So when did you first discover that you wanted to go that path of archaeology? Did you just stumble on it, or is it something that you knew an archaeologist? Like, how did you come across that?
I just stumbled on it. I remember in secondary school, high school in the US, we had to do some career thing. It was maybe my second to last year or something, and that's when I wanted to do something with history, and I just kind of stumbled onto it and was like, oh wow, you could do this. And then I found universities, and then I ended up applying. I applied for different things, but I ended up going for that. So, and it just happens that I managed to keep it going.
All the way up to having done your doctorate in it. So that's dedication for sure. So your presentation today tell us a little bit about it before we actually get into it.
Sure. So I thought I would talk a little bit, just kind of an overview of like what archaeology is, and then kind of what we've learned from that for Grenada, for the Caribbean and Grenada specifically. So looking at this, there are things that sort of, I guess archaeology is a way of answering questions that aren't in the written record, especially before there are written records for this area of the world. Archaeology is really integral, like it's all you have. But even during the historic period, I won't really get into that as much, but there's a lot of writing, but then you look at the archaeology and it kind of like, it's a different story. So sometimes you need both to get to at what the truth may have been.
Yes, and Grenada well, we were discovered in 1498, as the historical records show, by Christopher Columbus on his third voyage. Most likely the island is way older than when Christopher Columbus first discovered it, because of course we know that the Kalinagos were inhabiting the island before Christopher Columbus arrived. So we definitely well many decades old. So yeah, so it's interesting to know how the archaeology has maybe even changed over time.
Yeah, right. So like some of the first studies in the 1960s had a specific kind of idea, and that's changed a lot. Unfortunately, like what's taught in schools today in Grenada and all is kind of based on some of those earlier ideas. Actually, not even really the archaeology, just like some old ideas that are like Caribs and Arawaks, which I'll get into. One thing I would warn is that, like, I think on things like the CXC still are questions that talk about warlike Caribs and Arawaks. And so when I give a presentation like this, I always warn students that if you're asked that on the CXC, the correct answer might actually be like that Arawaks were peaceful or something, because they haven't updated them as far as I know.
Oh yes, and I used to teach Caribbean history, so I taught about peaceful Arawaks and warlike Caribs, and those we put those stereotypes around the Caribs and the Arawaks, right? And that's again interpretation based on whoever have written history, right? So it's always good to be cautious around these kind of stereotypes attached to those who have not had the privilege to tell their story.
Exactly.
Well, so I know I'll take it over to you, so you go ahead with your presentation, and I'll be just watching here, and yeah.
Okay, feel free to interrupt if I'm
if I have a question, I may stop you.
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay,
sometimes I do better that way. Okay, so I have to upload it.
Yeah, present. Do you able to see the present button?
Yeah, let's see.
In the bottom.
Oh, share screen. Sorry. Okay.
Yeah, share screen. Yes.
I was like, oh, do I have to upload the? Sorry.
No, that's fine. The technology always works with us. That I do trust.
Yeah. So you can see the first slide.
No, put it on the. Let me bring it up on this. Either I could bring it, and then you should be able to move it, right? So, just F5, and then just share it as a present. Yes. Or just share slideshow at the top, slideshow, or you could press F5.
Okay, so you do see it.
I do see it. It's being shown on the screen. Perfect. Yes. Perfect. Yes.
Sorry about that.
Yeah. Go right ahead. This looks like.
So I'll like I said, I'll talk a little bit about just kind of an overview. There's a lot of like specific issues and things I'm just gonna kind of glaze over, but anybody can always add. I don't know if people can comment, or later on, you feel free to message me questions. There's some big debates in Caribbean archaeology and academic circles that I'm really only gonna kind of brush on. But I do think Grenada is uniquely placed to answer some of those things. So I might mention some of those. So the background there is just is the Duquesne petroglyphs. If anybody's never been, you should go. It's right on the western side. Some really cool series of petroglyphs. And they're it's hard to date petroglyphs, but probably about between 900 and 1200 AD. So maybe about 1,000 years old, and they're still there. They were actually buried in the beach and dug out in the 1970s.
Oh.
So actually, I rearranged my slides a bit just before we came on, so hopefully I can remember what I was going to do. I decided to change the order, just might be a little bit more fitting. So underneath our feet, right, pretty much everywhere, there are these like time capsules, these like remnants of the past that, um, against all odds, have just survived to today. Just this piece of metal, this piece of pottery, maybe a little chip of a stone tool, and we kind of usually just disregard these things. We don't pay much attention to them. But in the right hands, with the right knowledge, you can unlock a whole bunch of information, and it can tell you, these things can tell you so much. A critical thing is not just the one object, but all the objects they're associated with and the whole context. So in this case, this is an excavation from Mont Rule near Mount Rich. And you can see the pottery in the side, just loads of pottery. And the ceramic sherds that we found there helped us to understand the time period and some of the things that were going on at the site. There were also soil stains. It's kind of hard to see, but there were like post hole stains where a post for a hut would have been, things like that. Another one, this is from Saltairs Bay, going under, I don't know if you can't really see can you see my pointer?
Yeah, yes, I'm seeing it.
Oh, you can see
Yes.
it?
Yes.
So underneath, we had like a gravel layer that was from the early 19th century, or sorry, early 20th century. Pavement probably from a house. There were a bunch of artifacts with marbles and coins. And this is just going down the layers, right? And then there was a burial of a Amerindian skeleton in the one side. This was all poking out. This was actually a wave cut, so we kind of had an idea. But so this gives you an example of sort of what's underneath our feet. I need to do one of these for Grenada, but this is from the UK, and it gives you an example of like all the different kinds of things that could be going on. In the UK, they have medieval stuff, and then Roman forts, and all these things that happened on that landscape. Ditches being dug and roads, and it just gets covered over, but parts of it are preserved, and you can, by looking at the entire context, you can really understand what happened in the past. But the thing is, these things are really ephemeral, and once they're gone forever. So one of my messages is that we need to preserve these things, at least look at these time capsules before we throw them away. Maybe they are useless, maybe we don't want this thing, but at least look at it and decide that before we're throwing it away. So it's not what you find, it's what you find out.
Okay.
Right? It's not that one image, not that one object, right? It's information that you get out of that. And the context is really important. We have tons of unknown things, like at the Grenada Museum. People brought in artifacts over time, and maybe it wasn't recorded for whatever reason. So we have a box of things we don't even know what site it's from. And I can't really learn much. I know it's from Grenada, so that's helpful. But then I can really only tell you about stuff that we learned from other sites where it was done archaeologically. I can say, oh, well, this type of ceramic is from this time period. That's only because we learned it elsewhere. I'm not really learning anything new. So it's really important, the context of what you find out. All right, so what is archaeology? I mentioned Indiana Jones. Tomb Raider's maybe a little older. Indiana Jones is a new movie coming out soon. And actually, I'll definitely go watch it. But it is not archaeology. Right, and Ancient Aliens, and these pretty much, and most of the things on History Channel or Discovery Channel these days are very disappointing. Aliens and just like pseudoscience. Archaeology is what I was showing you earlier, like excavating in the soil, little bits of sherds, and it's definitely not dinosaurs. A lot of people get that confused. So that's paleontology, and it's super cool. Dinosaurs are super cool. Grenada didn't have any dinosaurs. volcanically, it's just
Okay.
after the period where
Okay.
dinosaurs. But there are some awesome megafauna from like the ice ages that have been found in Grenada, and that is super cool. It's not something I do, but like giant sloths and giant capybaras, these like huge rodents. They're still up. Some of them are up in like Dominican Republic still,
Mm,
but we had things like that, and there are fossils of those in Grenada,
mm-hmm.
um,
Okay.
but that's not what I do. I only deal with humans. So as soon as humans show up, that's when I'm really that's when archaeology is actually involved. So it's kind of we're meticulously and systematically peeling back the
Mm-hmm.
layers of time and exposing what was there. So we're not just digging up, right? It's a science. It's
Mm-hmm.
organized, and we're very careful, and we're kind of looking for things like soil stains.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was saying with a post hole. I think the next image might. Or I have post holes later on. Like just if you would totally miss it if you didn't know what to look for, kind of. So whereas in Europe, you have these forts, and well, I mean we have some forts, but you have like masonry architecture and big things, stones, and when you're in the prior to the colonial period in Grenada, that stuff is really difficult to see. We do have petroglyphs and things like that, but a lot of it is very ephemeral.
Mm-hmm. So
So,
I have
yeah, go ahead.
one question before. So in terms of Grenada's context, like these sites, how do you find them? Is it that the community knows that such sites exist? Like how do you
Yeah.
get to know of these sites where you could begin the process of finding what's beneath the earth?
So a couple ways, yeah, the community,
Mm-hmm.
like people will bring things to the museum, and oh, we didn't know there was a site there. There have been lots of surveys over time of archaeologists going back to the 1960s,
Mm-hmm.
and amateur archaeologists in Grenada, like Alistair Hughes, who's a journalist. He was
Mm-hmm.
also like an amateur archaeologist, and he was actually instrumental in bringing the first American archaeologists from the Florida Museum here. And
Okay.
so like people like that had just been walking the beaches, and
Mm-hmm.
just finding stuff, and whoa, what's this? And then they ask someone. Another way that I've been doing a lot of is uh, predictive modeling. So looking at the environmental characteristics of sites and think where people had settled in the past, and kind of
Mm-hmm.
predicting what would be a high probability area, and then going and testing it. And it's been somewhat successful. I think the model is like maybe, I forget, it's like 60 or 70%. It's really hard
Mm-hmm.
to predict human behavior,
Mm-hmm.
but there are some characteristics that make some areas really high probability. And that's also really useful for planning and development now. And so when you have a construction project or something, ideally, and I've trying to work with physical planning over the years, that ideally you could just look at a map like that and say, oh, this is a really high probability area for Amerindian. We should do some archaeology. Or you'd say, well, there's really no probability, so it's probably
Mm-hmm.
fine.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so those are some of the ways.
Okay.
Uh, I'll get into some of that too. I have some examples
Oh,
of
okay.
predictive
Okay.
modeling stuff. So archaeology is in um, North America. It's part of anthropology. So anthropology is the study of people, of humans, and there's different subfields. So
Mm-hmm.
there's like cultural anthropology, which is what most people think of when they think of anthropology. There's linguistics and the study of language and how that interacts with culture. There's physical anthropology, and that's sort of like human evolution and um, physical aspects of the human body.
Mm-hmm.
And then archaeology, which is like basically past culture. Uh, in like Europe and such, archaeology is often separated, and anthropology is more like just cultural anthropology. Archaeology is more of a methods and like materials science. I personally, I mean, I'm biased because I went through this system, but I really do like the anthropological aspect of it, and a lot of European archaeologists bring in anthropology too, because the cultural comparisons are really useful. So, like in the Caribbean, looking at people in the Amazon today and how they live, even though it's thousands of years later and through a whole colonial filter, it's still useful to see what they're doing and how they're doing it, and you get a much better idea of what it was like. So that's one part of archaeology. But we deal with material culture, mostly like, these are like the tangible remains. We deal a
Mhm.
little bit with intangible things. Culture generally is intangible, right? But we deal with this sort of the tangible aspects that are of culture that are sort of imprinted on our material worlds. So artifacts, and I mean, you
Mhm.
think of all the things around you now, and our computers and our phones, and
Mhm.
those things, in 1,000 years, they speak to a specific type of culture,
Yes.
and what we're doing. Um, and those things change over time. I mean, you think
Mhm.
of, even, well, to speak of phones, you think of flip phones from
Mhm.
10, 20 years ago. And
Yes.
even
Yes.
before that, car phones, and then other
Yes.
things like,
Mhm.
you could look at a phone and you could tell the time period, right? Because
Mhm.
things go in and out of fashion. Same thing with
Mhm.
like cars, or
Yes.
buses in Grenada. You could tell an old bus from a new bus,
Yes. Yes.
over
Yes.
time.
Over time.
And that's the way
Mhm.
artifacts are. There
Mhm.
are, I mean, not everything, but a lot of, especially the decorative
Mhm.
elements,
Mhm.
we can tell over time, and you can look at. So if you
Mhm.
can do like a seriation of how those artifacts, how those designs changed over time, you can start
Mhm.
to pinpoint whenever you find that thing. You could say, oh, that's from this time period.
Mhm.
Um, and we also tie that to radiocarbon dates, which I'll get to in a minute. So ceramics are a big thing. Ceramics in the Caribbean are huge, because they're very distinctive over time periods. There are some plain
Mhm.
forms that it's hard to tell what period it's from, but the more diagnostic elements of, like especially the decorative things, have very specific time periods, and so we can tell. I can just look at a piece of pottery and say what time period it's from.
Mhm.
There are also the forms, like the type of vessel, and then sometimes the construction of what it was in it, how well fired it was, like in a kiln, an earth kiln. You have an idea maybe of the time period, but it's still not as good as the actually like the decorative elements. So here's like some seriation, and there's some old images, but over time how things kind of changed in the Caribbean. There's also stone tools. Those are pretty continuous throughout time as well. They made them in the ceramic period, but
Mhm.
a lot of times people will think of an earlier hunter-gatherer period,
Mhm.
pre-ceramic. We don't have any real stone tools from that time period in Grenada. We think there were people here, and I will get to some of the indirect evidence, but all
Mhm.
the stone axes and such that we find are from the ceramic period. And actually,
Mhm.
they were way better at shell tools. So that bottom piece is a shell tool. So from like conch, lampy
Mhm.
fragment, they would make pretty amazing tools. Uh,
Mhm.
I mean, you wouldn't necessarily chop a tree down with that, I don't think, but for
Mhm.
agriculture, as like a hoe or something,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
And so those are useful. And sometimes they change over time, some of the designs. This is an image I'm stealing from someone that that as an artist that drew an image. I think this was the Bahamas,
Okay.
and but it's very useful just to think of all the things going on
Mhm.
in an Amerindian like village, and
Mhm.
they're making in the back there that those are cassava cakes, or farine as we call them in
Yes. In
Grenada.
Green. Yes.
They're doing a whole bunch of farine production here.
Mhm.
But you look at this and like, what would even survive in 1,000 years? This is all pretty perishable stuff.
Mhm.
So like those ceramic pots,
Mhm.
we find pieces of those. Um,
Okay.
we find pieces of people's bones, and
Mhm.
pieces of the shell necklaces and things. But from this image, we might not find much at all. There's another one,
Mhm.
some weaving. So cotton is a Caribbean
Mhm.
um, plant that was
Mhm.
domesticated in the Caribbean. So they didn't have cotton in Europe before
Mhm.
Columbus. um, the only thing in this image that would survive, really, you see the dog playing with a spindle whorl.
Yes.
That's a stone, or usually a ceramic circle with a hole in it.
Mhm.
That's the only thing we'd probably find
Mhm.
from this.
Okay.
And but from that, we could say, oh, well, they were making cotton, you know.
Mhm.
Sometimes you would find the holes where these posts were. And
Mhm.
I think I have some other images of those coming up um, somewhere. I put them. But that's something that we might find.
Mhm.
But that's what makes it so difficult. And you really have to extrapolate from what you find to kind of say more about what what was in the area. Excuse me. So one thing I'm really interested in is the sort of environmental interactions with humans. So
Mhm.
how people interacted with the environment, and well, some of the ways that we learn about that are remains of fauna, so uh, animals that people ate, so the animal bones.
Mhm.
Macro remains of plants, although they don't survive that well.
Mhm.
But you do find this pollen and stuff survives really well. So I'll get to some of that.
Mhm.
Um, Coprolites are. I just throw that in there because people are always like blown away that like it's basically poop. It's like
Ah.
preserved poop from
Oh.
humans. We don't find
Okay.
it in the Caribbean really at all, right? It just doesn't survive except for there's a cave site in on Mona Island between Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and I'm
Mhm.
pretty sure that they had some coprolites in there.
Okay.
But those are super useful because what better direct evidence you have that people ate something than it's
Think.
in poop? So,
Yeah.
so when you do find something like that, it's like amazing. So usually cave sites are where something that could be preserved. Um, but then we take soil cores and lake cores to understand the environment and the different chemical interactions in the environment. There's things like genetics, and the sort of environmental pressures on plants and animals that over time that we could tell they were being influenced by humans. For instance, like Lambie, the size of Lambie decreases dramatically as soon as humans show up, and it continues throughout history to be much smaller today than they were in the past. So that's a size selective pressure that humans have put on Lambie. um, and other ethnographic analogies and stuff.
So I had one question before we get into this point. So what's the oldest plant or the oldest animal in Grenada's history?
Um, well, like uh, not
This,
that have
this,
been have anything to do with humans, but there are, like
mm-hmm.
I was saying, there are some giant sloth bones and
Oh,
a giant capybara, and they date to between 1 and 2 million years. They're found in mudstone at Point Celine. Prickly Point actually is where they found
okay.
them over by like Prickly Bands. If there's all mudstone there, and so these mudstone is formed through like volcanic lahar events. So like a volcano erupts and you get it interacts with like a flood, like a
Mm-hmm.
big and causes a flood, and so you get this like whole big mixture of just everything being taken down the hillside into the water, and you get animals trapped in there. Since they get really well preserved, and so you get some fossils. So actually, the mudstone at Point Celine is like really rich for something like that, like teeth of these. I think it was teeth of the sloth and capybara. So those are the oldest. In terms of humans, like when humans arrive, there are things that show up that humans brought with them. So like dogs show up, and we have some ancient dogs. They also brought like they might have brought not Hootia, but agouti, which don't really.
Oh, the agouti. Okay.
I think they were last sighted in the 1960s in Grenada, but
Mm-hmm.
we think actually they might have been brought by humans. There were also rice rats and hamsters and guinea pigs. Those were all like actually domesticated by Amerindians and brought with them. We also find deer bone, although we're
Oh,
pretty sure they didn't actually bring any deer. It's like worked bone. It's a
mm.
type of Amazonian deer. There's some really cool, actually, like there's a need for zooarchaeology in Grenada. So if anybody's interested in that, um, there hasn't been enough studying of the the sort of faunal remains that we find. So some of it has been analyzed, but I am not an expert in it, and you really need to be a specialist.
Okay, okay,
You
okay.
need like a comparative collection of like every bone in a dog's body to be able to tell if it's a dog, things like that. That's it's pretty. It's a difficult job.
Okay.
Um, why do archaeologists look at so there's some big questions we can answer from things like plants and animals and
Mm-hmm.
reconstructing the ancient environments, how the environment changed. We know that the environment was different today than it was 2,000 years ago. Sea
Mm-hmm.
levels have changed. um, Even the seasons have changed. There were periods of stronger drought and rainier periods. Like I said, you can understand domestication and how plants and animals were affected by humans. So to bring up dogs again, dogs are they're only all dogs. The only common ancestor are wolves. They were
Mm-hmm.
domesticated from wolves, but obviously they're not wolves. Humans have influenced them, and the same thing with like corn and all sorts of other plants that we eat. These things they're very different than their original progenitor, their ancient progenitor that humans started to mess with. Like corn was like a little pea pod in Central Valley, Mexico. And about 10,000 years ago, humans started eating these pea pods and picking out the bigger ones. And over time, the bigger ones, you started to select for those types of genes, and it just became corn, which is a like crazy thing when you look at them. But you also look at we also can see things like trade and exchange and how societies have become more or less complex over time and what that looks like. I don't want to spend. I know I'm probably going over a little time, so I won't talk too much more about Paleolithic in the botany. But there are remains like charred seeds and
Mm-hmm.
charcoal, and those kinds of macro remains we find. They're really useful. Usually, it's just like corn and stuff is like one of the few things that survive. But sometimes seeds can be really important. We find them by sifting, um,
16. Okay.
doing a specific type of what we call flotation, and you actually you run the soil samples through really fine mesh, and then
Mm-hmm.
you try it out. And someone trained in botany, paleoethnic botany, will look at the little plant parts and seeds and be able to tell what was in there. Pollen phyllus, the same thing, same way that we get it, but they're even microscopic, so you have to use a microscope. Um,
Mm-hmm.
um, yeah, there's a bias towards like some of the wind dispersed plants that like what we all are allergic to that just blast their pollen
Mm-hmm.
out into the atmosphere. Those show up like really prominently in the atmosphere or in soil samples, right?
Mm-hmm.
Versus things that are pollinated by animals like bees and stuff aren't as common. You're not going to get that in a lake core as common. So when you do find it, then there was a lot more of it. So we have to kind of adjust for the bias. But
Mm-hmm.
there are things that humans domesticated that as soon as you see it, a human must be around, such as maize pollen. So as soon as that shows up, humans are around because that's a domesticated crop. Same thing with like arrowroot and the bread nuts shows up, and there's a bunch of plants that humans brought in, but in terms of pollen, it's hard to get. The seeds sometimes are the only way. So in reconstructing all this, you can start to see changes in the landscape. And so here, where's my okay, so this is a really complicated graph, but it's also a really important one. So
Okay.
at the bottom here are climate records in different parts of the Caribbean
Mm-hmm.
and how climate had changed and how that interacts with. These are radiocarbon dates, which again I'll explain a little more, but basically show humans are around at this time period.
Mm-hmm.
Um, this up here there's a charcoal record from
Mm-hmm.
soil samples and like lake cores. So they
Mm-hmm.
take a big core and they go through each layer and they get samples from everything, and then they reconstruct a graph like this. And you can see volcanic events, and you can see how much tree pollen, so arboreal pollen was, and how much different types of herbs. And there's some specific plants like spondius that's with like hog plum. That's real common in some of these cores. And ferns, and we also got mangrove pollen, which I don't think I put in here. One of the coolest things about this graph is the arboreal column. You can see, so this is going back in time. So this is the oldest part of the core, and then this is modern times up here.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see sort of the ancient forests of Grenada, like covered
Mm-hmm.
in forests. And there's a little blip. It might line up with this volcanic event here, and
Mm-hmm.
then it kind of comes up, but then it goes down, and it never really rebounds. And we
Mm-hmm.
think that that's when humans start showing up, and there was
Okay.
slash and burn agriculture and planting. And this is what 3,000 BC,
Mm-hmm.
5,000 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have much other evidence of that, but it's a really indirect way of showing, like, well, there's probably humans around. We have some. There was some pollen found of arrowroot
Mm-hmm.
around this time too, and so we're
Mm-hmm.
pretty sure that must be there's people around. Not a lot. They're
Mm-hmm.
moving around the islands. They're just hunter gatherers. They came in through South America most likely, and they're just kind of moving around island to island and seasonally following different even animal migrations and stuff. Um, but we're pretty sure that they were planting things and they would leave and they'd come back and they'd harvest some of the root crops and stuff. So
So,
that's actually some of the coolest evidence of that.
so basically, it's like showing that humans basically have impacted um the land significantly, because 3,000 years ago we were so much, and now we have decline. We have seen the decline over time. And do
Exactly.
you,
Yeah.
and do you expect that over time it will be more? It will stay the same? Can we go back and recover some of that? Like, what's the future looking like?
Well, there's no way to probably recover all the way, right? Because we have to live here too.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
But it does speak to the decline of forests. Like Grenada has a lot of forests, a lot of trees,
mm-hmm.
more than other islands even. But look at how much it's declined over time. So
Yes.
it is important to preserve these things because they provide a whole bunch of other ecosystem services. And I
Mm-hmm,
mean, the trees have a direct relationship to rainfall and this and
mm-hmm,
that, and how much is retained in the soil. So we need areas that are forested. So I think it is, yeah, it's something to consider, that like protect Grandatang and these
mm-hmm,
areas. Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Um,
Okay.
oh, so here's some of the sampling. Here's some people coring a wetland. So it doesn't even have to be a lake. It could just be like a marsh. And because of the environment in the soil, which is it lacks a lot of oxygen, things get really well preserved. And then on the right are some soil sampling and an excavation. That's what I focus a lot on, soil sampling, and so you run those samples for different like chemical analyses and things. So actually, here's an example. So this is
And
Antoine Bay, just south of Bathway. So I did a big survey, and we found a lot of sherds. These are diagnostic types of sherds from a specific time period, basically about 9 to 1200 AD. A ton of that, but it was hard to see the boundaries of sites and where the sites kind of just merge into each other. But in the soil samples,
mm-hmm,
I ran them for phosphorus, and humans mess with phosphorus a lot. Phosphorus is a major element for plants. You need some phosphorus in the soil to grow
mm-hmm,
plants. But humans, because we eat plants and we harvest plants, and then we tend to bring them all in one spot and chop them up and cook them. There's a bunch of phosphorus in the areas where we cook and where we eat and where we live,
mm-hmm,
and it preserves well in the soil. So you could really see. I'll actually go back again. It's the same map here, and you
mm-hmm,
could see how it just pops out in green areas where there were.
mm-hmm,
These are sort of the boundaries of the sites,
mm-hmm.
and that's really useful. So sometimes it's really useful for understanding the extent of the site, how big, for what's there, in addition to the soil. Okay, so here's the post holes. Although you can't really, you can kind of see one here. This dark area, this little post. But what they did was, this is like a bird's eye view, and they mapped them all. This is from La Poterie,
Mm-hmm.
just south of even that map where it just had. they mapped all these post holes that they found, and they were actually able to connect the dots a little and see how the huts were constructed.
Mm-hmm.
So what happens is you get these post holes from a couple of different ways, maybe two or three ways. Basically, when you stick a post in the ground, uh, it you're kind of pushing it down into other layers, right, deeper and deeper, and then that post is going to stay there until it's pulled out or until it burns or it rots away. So if it burns, it's going to leave a big piece of charcoal there, and you're going to see that charcoal stain. It's going to be in the shape of a post hole. If it rots away, it's going to be kind of similar thing. It's going to be darker. And actually, if you pull the post up and use that for something else, the soil from the top is going to fall into it, and it's going to actually be different soil than the rest of that profile. And then you still see the shape of the post hole, and so that's how we're able to see it, just when we excavate. And so by mapping these out, you can see actually the shapes of huts. This is a really famous one. This is one that kind of proved the concept of this in the 80s, in St. Eustatius. So they're connecting, those dots are the post holes, and then they connected them. And there seems to be, the top one seems like the Big Dipper or Little Dipper, some constellations, but also like they're building windbreaks, and they're these big huts, where probably a lot of families lived in. So it gives us an idea of what's happening at different time periods, and even this is an earlier period than the ones from the poetry, which were smaller, and so you can kind of see some change of time with that.
I had one question before you get to petroglyphs. So in Grenada, some of the examples you mentioned seem to be based heavily in the northern parish of St. Patrick's. Based on your findings, is it that it's more so in the north that you'll find like artifacts and those things as opposed to like the southern, and the second part would be, why is that?
Yeah, well, not necessarily. Although with petroglyphs, it's going to be a different story. But with sites, they're all over, mostly on the coast.
Okay.
And you know what? I don't know if I actually included a map of all the sites. I think I have an extra slide somewhere. I'll show you at the end, a map of all the sites. That was really remiss. But they're all over. There's like 89 Amerindian sites that we found so far.
Okay.
That might be, I think there's like 120, 130 in St. Vincent's that were identified. So maybe we're on par, or there's maybe some more that we haven't identified yet.
Okay.
But they're all over. So I know St. Patrick is the historic parish, but it's not necessarily true. I would say there are probably as many or more sites in St. George than St. Patrick. St. John is one that's lacking a lot. And I don't know if that's because we just haven't surveyed it enough, or the western coast, there's not as many. Whereas in St. David's and St. Andrew, like on the east side, you have all these little bays, and every little bay there's a site.
Okay.
There are little ceramic sherds on the beach, all throughout those parishes.
Okay.
And there's little bays and stuff. But maybe the cliffs and such, and on the western side, prevented more settlements. Also, there's more coral reefs on the eastern side, so just in terms of that. But actually, the earliest sites, though, so Pearls is one of the earlier sites. We kind of mentioned Pearls, but so is Boujajou. There's a really early site, and actually, so is Saltaires. Now we have some radiocarbonates, Saltaires being very early. So the earliest settlers were pretty well spread out, and then they kind of fill in. I have a map of that. Oh, I do have a map of all the sites. I'll show you.
Okay.
Petroglyphs now are a different story. They tend to only be in like the northeast corner for some reason, or northwest corner. Sorry, plus Mount Rich, which we kind of include in that little northwest chunk. But like Duquesne, and there's one outside of Victoria, and one in Union, and Mount Rich, but not anywhere else. There are workstones. I'm going to talk about workstones. But petroglyphs, the only real definite ones that we have, and there have been some speculation of ones elsewhere, but they don't seem very real. Like things like this, like from Mount Rich, This is actually a photo from the 1920s where they chalked it. This is one from actually St. John, Virgin Islands, but the paper that they talk about this one is really useful for trying to understand what they mean, because there's really not a lot. We really have no idea what these mean. We have no idea what is actually going on here. There is some good hypotheses, and
Okay.
one of them from St. John is that these are where sites where ancestors gather. So Amerindians believe that they were animists and everything was alive and everything, every rock and tree had a soul, and then your ancestors, when they died, they could help you in this life, and so there's sort of an ancestor worship thing that goes on. And so we think maybe these are places where ancestors would gather. These are clearly sacred places. But in terms of what they mean, we can only really speculate. But then there's work stones. Work stones occur actually throughout the island. I think there's about a dozen work stone sites now, and they're all over. Mostly on the coasts, but Mount Rich has one in the middle of the island, and they're not all the same. So some of them are clearly for making stone tools, which is what we always say. So this is the one by the Green Bridge in Queens Park, which is actually out front the stadium now.
Okay.
They actually removed it when they replaced that bridge. So this is an older picture when it was in the water. But so that one has some lines for sharpening stones and for grinding these ground stone axes. There's other ones though, like this one from Bujiju. That looks more like a Mexican metate or like a mortar and pestle kind of thing for grinding grain or grinding something more for food production, probably not necessarily stone tools. And then this other one, like who knows? This one, it's a massive rock. It hasn't moved in a million years, but they did these impressions on the side. And it almost doesn't even seem to have much of a function. It might be some sort of ritual aspect. And these ones are usually associated with petroglyphs. They don't usually occur on the road.
Okay.
There is, here's the map. So you see how all the petroglyphs are just up here.
Up here, okay.
But there's work stones. There's actually a good work stone in Soubise that's not on this map.
Okay.
And telescope. There's one that's buried under the rocks now. Telescope. But so work stones occur at all the petroglyph sites, but then they also occur on their own. And there's a tour you could take. You could go to it's called Petroglyph Path. You could go to that website, and we put signs up about in 2017. Most of the signs are now falling down and pretty bad, so we need to replace them. But we tried tying them together into like a tour where you could go. You could even self-guided and just go and follow the signs for.
Okay. Okay.
I would encourage people to especially Duquesne and Mount Rich are like the ones you got to see if you haven't seen. And Mount Rich has a whole there's a whole community center around that, and there's some local young people that are running this little center, and they talk about the petroglyph there, and they talk about the history of Mount Rich and stuff. So they do a pretty good job. We would like to do that. There's a nascent group in Duquesne that we're trying to do something similar with.
Okay.
With their petroglyphs.
So just before you move on, I had a question. So in terms of the preservation of these sites, both the workstone sites, the petroglyphs, well, the Mount Rich one is taken care of, and then the Duquesne Bain, that's one is going to get going with the young group you mentioned. But some of the others, like, because these sites are in the open, they're not being... Who has oversight over them, and what is being done to preserve them so that they're maintained?
Yeah, well, nobody. I mean, it's technically, you have like people like Michael Jessamy in the Ministry of Tourism, who's a cultural heritage officer, and you have some cultural heritage officers in the ministry, and they traditionally have done this, but they don't necessarily have legislation for it. The museum, technically, through legislation, the Museum Act in 2017, it put the museum in charge of all of this stuff. Actually, the Minister of Culture, but the museum through the Minister of Culture. to be in charge of all archaeological sites and all artifacts over 50 years old, actually, and technically owned by the state. And
Okay.
but it's yet to really be implemented, and there's no real management plan. Um, there's a petroglyph outside of Victoria, just before if you're coming from the south, it's just before the bridge on the left hand side. There's a sign that points to it. Super cool, but it's hard to see it. Sometimes I go by and I can't see it at all, depending on the lighting. Part of it is that people have been chalking it for years now, and that actually kind of degrades it over time. It helps you see it, and it seems benign, but the chemistry of the chalk and the rock kind of it exfoliates the rock faster. So there's just no management of it. And people sometimes scrub them so you can see them, but then that it takes all the lichen and the moss off of them that were actually kind of protecting them at that point. And now, there's just no management of these things.
Okay.
But they need to be. They've been preserved for this long.
Yes, and definitely going forward, we definitely want to keep them so that future generations could see them and so forth like that. And are they like, can they be moved, like those that are like more nothing too big? Can they be moved, or they must be preserved on the site itself?
They're all monsters. Yeah, they're all monster rocks. Like actually here on the left this is the one outside the stadium. So they did move this. So when they were replacing the bridge by Queen's Park in 1999, they moved it. It was in forestry. It was in Queen's Park for about 20 years. And we finally moved it out front of the stadium. So they got a big crane, and they moved the whole thing, or maybe it was a backhoe. It's a big process. Some of them though are just way too big, and
way too big.
Are deep, like Mount Rich. Those are way deep in this ravine. There's no way.
Okay.
They really have to be preserved in place.
Okay. I was just curious. Okay.
Yeah. Good question. People wonder that.
Yeah.
So these are radiocarbon dates, and I don't think I have time to really get into too deep in like the physics and the chemistry of radiocarbon, but it's a super interesting and important part of archaeology now. It's actually the only Nobel Prize in archaeology was the discovery of Willard Libby and the discovery of radiocarbon dating in the 1950s, or the late 1940s, 1950s. It came out of the atomic bomb, nuclear, the atomic bomb studies. He was on like the Manhattan Project and things like that, but some of these scientists recognized in the process of messing with things like uranium and all, that some of these elements like carbon seem to have a clock. And actually any radioactive element, they're really unstable, but they're very predictable too. And so he started looking at, after that project, he started looking at carbon and how if that could be seen as a clock. And it turns out like carbon is everywhere, right? It's in the air. We exhale carbon dioxide, we breathe in some carbon from the air. And that carbon, the isotopes of carbon, the different variations of it, based on how many electrons it has, there's usually carbon-12 and carbon-13, and there's a very stable. But then every once in a while, there's a carbon-14, and it's super unstable. But it actually changes to nitrogen at a known rate. He figured out the rate. So I forget what it is, 7,600 years is the half-life. So by taking something like a bone, anything that was alive, and seeing how much carbon-14 is in it, and then actually comparing it to how much carbon-14 over time through tree rings and such, we can see how carbon has changed in the atmosphere. You can get a date. You can see how long time has passed. He actually didn't know that part in the beginning. He didn't know that you needed to know past. He thought carbon was stable in the atmosphere, and so his initial dates were wrong. But we've refined it to a point now where you can get super accurate dates. I mean, like they are able to do carbon dating on like Maya lintels in like Guatemala and stuff, which have calendar dates on them, and we can actually get the radiocarbon date. Like it just shows that the radiocarbon date is within a 15-year and sometimes you can get even closer to that if you used other methods. But but the radiocarbon dating, the main point is that they are not dates; they're probabilities, and
Okay.
they're date ranges. So when I say that the ceramics were from 9 to 1200 AD, that's
That.
based on some radiocarbon dates, and
Mm.
it's a 300-year spread. Some of them are really widespread. These are old dates, but the newer dates we have, they're much nicer. So these are some of the early ones.
Some of the earlier ones. Okay.
We've tied those to some of the ceramics, so you can. So as I said, the ceramics change over time, and now you can take charcoal from that same context where this specific type of pottery was found. This specific design is white on red up here on the left, or these type of little animal figurines, and they're only made at certain time periods. And so then you can get if you get a radiocarbon date, now you have an idea of the time period, and you get dates from all over, from every site where these are found, and you start to see this longer spread, and we're able to see like the earliest start of this type of ceramic and the latest end of it, and how these things come and go over time, and then how and so that these are basically like changes in culture that you can, kind of macro changes that you can see, and radiocarbon dates, so they help us kind of anchor that chronologically. We can also tie those characteristics of the ceramics and such. You can take like this is so like all these different sites in Grenada and what type of pottery, what the radiocarbon dates were, like the earliest radiocarbon dates, and then what type of pottery is found there, and you can see how over time what sites were occupied at what time, and then you can make something like this little GIF image. So this is moving through time. It starts at about 300 AD. You can see the changes in basically population, the sites that date to each time period. And the earliest they're really like 1 to 200 AD now. So this map's a little older. We have some earlier. Around 700-800 though, you've seen this explosion.
Yes, yes, yes.
So these, so we know, and so the changes in color that you're seeing there are like ceramics change. So the earliest types of ceramics, and the orange comes in, and that's a different type of ceramic, and there's a lot of it. So probably migration of people. I mean, population just explodes, right? So pretty cool. We're pretty sure at this time period that there is a migration.
Yeah, 800 to 900. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's constant movement from South America. They're constantly going back and forth. And the colonial period. Here's another. In the colonial period, we know from historic records that they're seeing lots of canoes going back and forth. There are reports like from Trinidad where ships stayed in harbor. I mean, this is in the 1600s. Ships stayed in harbor because all the Caribs, quote unquote, were migrating south. They were going to South America, like huge, like hundreds of them. So over time, you have constant exchange with the mainland, and all the pottery and stuff that we see in the Caribbean. Well, there are some distinctive Caribbean elements, but we see, as you see changes on the mainland, it shows up in the Caribbean, and that's, there's intermarriage, and so there's a constant exchange. There's trade. We get animal, like I said, the deer bones. They're from Amazon. It's not from. There were no deer in Grenada. There's no evidence of deer, right? But so they're trading that, and you get things like different types of gemstone. Amethyst is a big one. They're coming, and also obsidian and things like that. So lots of trade, and we can see these waves of migration, and then you see all these little like smaller migrations and changes in time periods. Another line of evidence that we look at, this isn't really archaeology, but this is linguistics. So this is where the anthropology comes in. So analyzing the language that was being spoken at the time of contact, when Europeans started recording this stuff, especially Catholic priests like the Jesuits and Franciscans. They were those orders were founded in order to proselytize and convert originally Caribs and then other Native Americans to Christianity. And so in order to do this, they needed to learn the language. And so they were actually really instrumental for us in understanding what those languages were. And so even words like Cameroon come from this dictionary that was by Friar Breton in the 1600s, who recorded a whole dictionary. And
Mm-hmm.
but now by analyzing that, actually he was in Guadeloupe and Dominica,
Okay.
so it wasn't Grenada. And one of the other aspects of this is that all the islands, basically everybody was a little bit different, but they
Mm-hmm.
did speak a common language, and actually all throughout the Caribbean. So from Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, they had a similar language as down here. So
Okay.
this whole Arawak and Caribs thing, actually, they're all Arawakan languages, is what we have
Okay.
to know.
Mm.
And there is a language family called Caravan, which might be
Mm-hmm.
Carib. But the words from that we have are really just like trade things that you use.
Mm-hmm.
It's like a trade language is what we call it. But the main language, the language they were predominantly using was Arawakan family. So there's different
Mm-hmm.
variations of it. Um, but it's kind of like saying like a Romance language or versus like a Germanic language or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so we're able to kind of reconstruct that, and just like we're able to reconstruct like English and early versions and proto languages, we're able to earlier versions of it. We're able to do that with these Amerindian languages, and so that's really useful in understanding cultural changes as well.
Mm-hmm. Is there any are there any words that remain today from that Arakan language that we know
Yes,
of?
there's a ton. Yeah, I'm gonna get to it at the end, but
Okay.
things like I said, Cameroon is there's different variations of that are recorded, but that is what Grenada was
Mm-hmm.
called. Actually, I
Mm-hmm.
have. Well, this is so. These are all the Amerindian names from that dictionary
Mm-hmm.
for all the islands. So
Oh wow.
it actually says Kamahuya. That's another variation that we see for Cameroon, Kamahuya. Carriacou, it's not listed here. Oh, yeah, there it is, Carriacou. That's a Amerindian word or Arawakan
Okay.
word. So these are all, and so there's things like Cuba, still the
Mm-hmm.
same.
Mm-hmm.
Where's Jamaica? It's spelled that way, but Jamaica.
Okay.
Um, yeah. So Haiti. So these are the original names, and they stayed. Borican, I don't know. I know a lot of Puerto Ricans in New York, and Puerto Ricans have a very they've really embraced the indigenous
Okay. Mm.
nationalism, right? And so a lot of people will call themselves, they'll say they're Puerto Ricans, they're New Yorkers, and they're Boricanos or Boricanas, and that's the indigenous name of Puerto Rico. Um, we're not quite there yet in Grenada, but maybe people will start to see it as themselves more indigenous. Because there are things that we do that I'll talk about that are
That
definitely Amerindian.
okay.
Um, all right, so I guess could get into some of the things that people might know or have learned already, right? So we learned about Caribs and Arawaks, and probably in primary and secondary school. Um, Archaeologists don't really use these terms. You might have seen some of the words I had on there. I had saladoid and tromasoid. These are the ceramic types. We don't
Mm-hmm.
really talk about Caribs and Arawaks. As I said, the languages were all Arawakan, and even the word Arawak, though, was assigned in the 19th century by a linguist who was
Mm-hmm.
breaking down the families from South America and the Caribbean. And so he gave that word Arawakan. Like Columbus never used that. He did use words like Carib, but to the early Europeans, they were either Caribs or they were Indios. And the Indios were like the friendly ones that we might think of as Arawaks, and then the Caribs were anybody that attacked them. So there's actually instances of the same Amerindian being called an Indio, and then later on they run into him and he's a Carib because he attacked them. And they used the word Carib all over the place. The Spanish actually used it in the Philippines later by indigenous Filipino people that attacked them. There are mentions of Caribs. So they kind of the word was around. Like there are people that call themselves Caribs in South America. Um, in the Caribbean, there were people that called themselves similar things. So that's where you get Kalina is derived from like they're all related. Carib, Kalina, Kalinago, and also Galibi is another one that I'm going to talk about. They're all variations of the same words, but whether they really didn't call themselves that, and what we think of as these as Caribs didn't exist. There were no cannibals, right? And like, I mean, there were like the images in Europe in the 16th century and such are like dog-headed man beasts, and like, you know, just the eating humans, and just these horrible marauding people. This really fed into a European narrative and agenda to basically take the land and enslave the people. So and the Catholic Church sort of encouraged that, sort of indirectly, because they made these papal bulls that said, well, you can't enslave anybody, but except unless they're Caribs. So if they're cannibals, then you can enslave them. And so, oh well, everybody suddenly Carib. So they didn't really use those words. There's not any evidence when we look at human bones that we find the remains of humans, Amerindians. There's no evidence of butchery like you would see on like on a chicken bone today. You would see how people cut the bone and ate it, right? And you don't see that on human bones in the Caribbean. There might have been some out there. It might have happened in some very ritualistic way, like maybe eating a piece of flesh, cooked flesh of your enemy, or something, like you're dominating over them. Or maybe there is also maybe possible evidence of ancestor worship and sort of trying to embody that spirit of just a little piece. And it's not, I mean, when you think Catholics and eating the body of Christ, and the transhumanism, what's the word? I forget what the word is. I'm not a good Catholic. But you actually believe that you're eating the body of Christ, right? That's cannibalism.
Right? Okay. I know what you mean. And I know that part in the church service, yes, where you take the bread and wine, yes.
Right. And also you get in Roman Catholic churches, you get relics and human bones that are preserved, saints and such. Actually, so it's almost like the accuser was more guilty than the accused of these things. So yeah, so what we know of as Carib, what we think of them, did not exist, but there were these people at the time. Really, what happened was in the Greater Antilles, people got wiped out really fast, and they were kind of taken by surprise. And a lot of them that could escape came down into the Lesser Antilles. And so you had, because the first slaves in the Caribbean were Indians, Amerindians, and they didn't do so well. And so then you start to get the movement of the African slave trade, right? And oh well, we need some stronger people that are but they were raiding all of these islands, the Lesser Antilles. They were the Spanish in particular were raiding them for slaves to bring up to the Bahamas and Dominican Republic and all that. And some of the early and Cuba. There's actually a really cool archaeological site in Cuba where we actually found the remains of, it's all burial ground of Amerindians from the early 1500s, and they've done some chemical isotopes that things like strontium. You can tell where people were born, and they're from all over the Caribbean. So these are people that were probably taken in slave raids, including Grenada. Some of the islands were completely depopulated by slave raids. Like Barbados supposedly had no Amerindians when they landed, but we know they were there, and they were there pretty late into the contact period. But they weren't there at the very end. We're pretty sure they were just rounded up, and then they fled. But what happened was that the Caribs were very resistant, and they did the interaction with the Europeans galvanized this identity where you had these individual islands. So all of them called themselves different things. There's a quote from a priest in early 1600s in Venezuela talking about a people called the Camahugas. who live on the island of Kamahuga, and it's probably Cameroon. It's Grenada.
Grenada, yes,
It's an
that's.
island people,
Mm-hmm,
right? And so that's what they called themselves. They didn't necessarily call themselves by any macro name.
mm-hmm,
They intermarried between islands and the mainland. So they were similar cultures, but they probably identified maybe by village and then by islands.
mm-hmm,
And so it's not until the Europeans show up and
mm-hmm,
there's this need to group. And so by
mm-hmm,
the time Europeans are in the Western Antilles, these Caribs, the Kalinago, we call them now, were able to unite and fight them off for 150 years. I mean, Grenada wasn't settled successfully until 1649, and there were people here, there were Amerindians here, which we'll talk about in a second, Leapers Hill, but so that's 150 years of basically fighting off European colonialism, and so they were really successful at it, and that's where this sort of stereotype really comes from, and that they were able to resist. They didn't want their land taken away, you know. So I'll get into some early accounts, and like the Leapers Hill thing and Saltaires. So Saltaires is a great example. In 1614, there's this Spanish merchant who wrote about and drew a picture here of an encounter he had in Grenada. So this is before Europeans arrived. It's after the first attempt, the 1609 attempt by the British, totally failed, but before the French show up. So some Spanish ships come. He just comes to water his boats. He says he gets attacked by Caribs off the north coast of Grenada. So when you look at this map, I mean, it just jumps out at you that that's Leapers Hill there. And when you compare it to
today,
today, right? Actually, this map's a little old. There's a breakwater here now. I changed it. We'll talk about that in a second. But so this is Leapers Hill, and where they're coming out of is where we know an archaeological site existed with the Patrick River. So that's really interesting. To have a watercolor and drawing Amerindians coming from there. And what's also interesting is 1649. These people are basically the grandparents of the people who would leap off the hill. It's not much longer, 40 years.
Is there any reason why they would have been attracted to that particular location in Grenada?
The Europeans or
both the Europeans and the Amerindians.
I'm not sure, but we do find a lot of trade goods from this time period in Saltaires. We find stuff from actually at La Poterie. There's a Spanish coin that they found. Okay. And there's also lots in La Poterie and also Saltaires, lots of pipe bowls, and some of them have emblems that are like Dutch from like the 1500s and 1600s, and we can actually date some of these. These are like trade goods. I mean, Europeans were trading different goods. They had metal axes and things, and pipes, and they had these clay pipes. They would trade those for tobacco and stuff, right? And other kinds of goods, and also to get water and stuff for the boats. So we find that, and Saltaires is one of these places where you find a lot of trade goods. So it seems to have been a stop.
A trading stop.
They didn't seem to like the Spanish, but there's reports from the Dutch and the French that actually were way more successful at trading with them. So maybe it's this legacy of the slave raiding, like I said.
Maybe.
But they didn't seem like the British much either. The British were less successful than the British and interacting. But so in 2017 or so, they built a breakwater. You can kind of see it. I don't have a great picture, but this is kind of sticking out here. It caused all kinds of problems at Saltaires Bay, and this archaeological site, which is right here at Mount Craven, is being ripped apart because the waves are being concentrated there, and there really needs to be something done soon, because every dry season the currents change, they get more intense, and the breakwater it saved the town, but it redirected all the energy into one area, and it just happens to be this really important site. where there's all these Amerindian bones. It's a really great preservation for
Mm-hmm.
skeletons. Now these aren't skeletons from Leapers Hill. It's like a cemetery, and there's over 100 probably. We have about 40 that we've collected, but they've been washing out into the sea, and most of them date to that time period, 900 to 1200 AD. So there's a increase in population, and there seems to be some changes in how people are burying their dead at the time, and we just happen to get good preservation in this area. So it's a really important site. We've done a community project where we
Mm-hmm.
trained some young people in like archaeological methods, and we did some surveys. We actually have another one coming up this summer. Do some excavations, and we've expanded what we know about the site. The site goes all the way under the town of Saltaires. Some of the
Okay.
earliest stuff is actually really under the town, along Coconut Row and stuff. There's some really early ceramics, and then the village kind of migrates. And actually, this is where all the burials are over there. But the site is also really important because people were living there from so this area is 200 to 300 AD. We have evidence, and then we have evidence all throughout time. Like I said, those burials were like 9 to 1200 AD, and of course we know people are living there in the 1600s and the 1650 Leapers Hill event. What's also interesting about the Leapers Hill event is that one of the earliest versions of the story, it doesn't just say Caribs. They actually say, in French, this is translated here. In French, they say Caribe and Galibis, and that there's two different type groups. The French actually, in the early documents, they describe two peoples, Galibis and Caribes,
Yes.
and they say that the Galibis are living in like the southeast, and the Caribs are in the north and in the west.
Okay.
And when we look at stuff, so there's a beach in St. David called Galby Bay.
Yes.
Right, and that's the original maps. The earlier maps call it Anstey Galibis, and there is the Amerindian site there, and the type of pottery matches what we think would be. Whatever. I'll get to that in a second. It matches what we would think as these a specific group of people from South America that called themselves Galibis, and they did have a distinctive pottery, and so they may have been living in Grenada at the time. So it just shows that this idea of Caribs is a mixture. It's a heterogeneous mix of people from every island, and it's a multi-ethnic category. And they were really just calling themselves, whenever they did call themselves that, it was really to strike fear in the Europeans, so it was an effective way of communicating. It's also communicating that you're an indigenous person. So you don't have to describe your village and everything, but by saying Carib, the same way that people today still use, majority of Native Americans would, South America, for instance, call themselves Indios. And it doesn't mean they're from India, right? It's just that this is what Europeans labeled them. And they have their own names, but just to communicate something very quickly and simply, they say Indio. And that's a lot. Yeah.
So the bones that were found at Saltaires Bay are from which peoples?
Well, we're not sure.
Okay.
You mean between Galibi and Carib?
Yes.
Well, it's both, really, I guess. But
okay.
we're not sure. In truth, those burials are earlier than when Caribs are supposed to have showed up, and that site goes back to 200 to 300 AD. So there's a continuous occupation from some of the earliest peoples to arrive in Grenada. So these are not Caribs, what we would consider Caribs of recent invaders. These are people that would consider Arawaks in the earliest group, though they didn't, again, call themselves that. So Saltaires Bay, in particular, has this continuous occupation of people all the way through the whole chronology, the whole sequence of Grenada, and so they go back. They have some of the deepest roots.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Whereas Galby Bay, the radiocarbon dates from Galby Bay are from 12 to 1300 AD, and they're later. There might be an earlier component to that site. We haven't done a lot there, but and that site there's a lot of sand mining at Galby Bay, but at the at present, that site seems to be pretty like a short occupation, pretty late in the sequence.
Okay. Okay.
In terms of like whether or not Leapers Hill happened and all, something did happen.
Mm.
The earliest variation of the story says that it was a surprise attack. That there was like a sort of traitor
Mm-hmm.
Carib who went to the French and told them that these people, that Caribs and Galibis were meeting on this hill
Mm-hmm.
and getting drunk and stuff. And so there was a surprise attack. And rather than be killed by their enemy, some of them, who
Mm.
knows how many, jumped.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe some of them even survived the jump. I mean, we're not even sure exactly what part of the hill it was. And I could get into whether or not what we call Leapers Hill is the real spot. But it was
Okay.
somewhere around there that we actually think where the Anglican Church was, because the Anglicans replaced the Catholic churches, and the Catholic Church was built atop the original Leapers Hill. So,
Mm-hmm.
but in that area, often people think that was like the end of Caribs, the end of Amerindians in Grenada, and that's not true at all. They continued to live into the 1700s, so kind of on the outskirts of plantations. Most of them either integrated or left for the mainland and other islands. A lot of them concentrated in St. Vincent's, and then Dominica, of course, was sort of the last stand where there are Kalinagos today in the Carib Reserve.
Mm-hmm.
So they did. I mean, it was only a few that would have jumped. It does seem it's such a unique, event that it's unlikely that the French made it up. It seemed to have scarred them, and the priest that writes about it, he writes it like it was the most horrific thing ever, and that they shouldn't be killing these people and all that. So something happened there, and so the name, of course, the name Sauterres is the Leapers, and so so the name is derived from really an Amerindian event there. So there's one legacy right there. If you live in Sauterres, that you're using a name that was, it's not a Amerindian name, but it's it's from an Amerindian event. The earliest map that we have was the French map from 1667. It was super, super interesting. A lot of the areas names that we would be familiar with are there from the early French period. But one really interesting thing is that he points out where there are Caribs living. Carbettes are what the French called their houses, and they're on that map. And this is Morne du Sauterres right there, and there are Carbettes, and this is 1667, so this is after the Leapers Hill event. There's still Amerindians living there, and also like Duquesne. So they're all over. This is La Poterie and River Antoine area.
Okay.
So up in the north, they were still living. In the late 1600s, there were villages still here.
Okay.
So these are not these little. What's funny, he uses the same image for houses down in St. George, what was called Port Royal at the time. But he used the same image, but there are no Amerindians living, or there are no Europeans living up here at the time, and the word Carbet is used for Amerindian huts.
Okay.
So this is the Galibi pottery that I was talking about. Coming to the end. Sorry, I'm going over how much time I have. So this is the Galibis. They lived along South America, and we have an idea of where Suriname and French Guyana, the Guyanas, is where they largely came out of, and the type of pottery that we find associated with sort of the last Amerindians, the last Caribs, they were making a type of pottery that was similar. We call it Kayo.
Okay.
It was very hard to identify it at first. It's only in the last 10 years we've found sites with it. And actually in Argyle, St. Vincent, when they were building the airport, their new international airport, it's built atop of a big Amerindian site, and they found pottery with trade goods, beads, glass beads, and European bottle glass and stuff in the pottery. So that was really cool to see.
Do you know if there are any Grenadian artisans who are really reliving or duplicating this kind of pottery today? Is there people on island like making pottery that resembles what would have been in that period of time?
Um, Great question. There is a guy I've never actually met him, but down I need to go visit this guy. Down at the craft market in St. George's.
Yes.
Yeah, there's a ceramic place, but I
Okay.
don't think he. I think he only does it. We have some stuff at the museum that he did.
Mm-hmm.
Things with animal figurines on the handles and all, attempting to duplicate it. And
Okay.
but I don't think he sells it. I'm not quite sure, but there were
Okay.
people that tried, and I don't think it was well marketed or well supported, and it kind of died,
Okay. Okay.
unfortunately. And but it would be, yeah, that is something that we really should be doing more, to do replicas,
Mm-hmm.
and even the European pottery that you find, some
Mm-hmm.
pearlware and porcelain, Dutch variations, and these like designs from China, and like this blue and white pattern wear from early 1700s and stuff. Yeah, people would buy replicas of that. We could be doing that here,
Mm-hmm.
um, and that would be a really great little industry.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There is, of course, like Jessie and Jessime does. She has her nutmeg
Nutmeg prints, yes.
designs. Yeah,
Yes.
she does Amerindian inspired prints.
Okay.
Some
Okay.
stuff is inspired by
Okay.
like petroglyphs and stuff. So there are some
Mm-hmm.
people that are really trying.
Mm-hmm. 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 Maybe there'll be more of it with the expansion of the creative industry as of the talk is about. So, but
Yeah, yeah.
definitely,
There we go.
I think there's opportunity to use some of this historical knowledge and put it into whether it's ceramics, whether it's cloth, whether it's art, right? But for sure, more of that could be
Absolutely.
done. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be a great initiative to support
Mm-hmm.
that. Yeah, the
Mm-hmm.
creative economy.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
So my last slide. Okay, I just have a few more slides left. This is sort of speaking to like, well, what happened. I
Mm-hmm.
kind of mentioned there was slave raiding. There was also a lot of disease, waves of disease that even preempted the Europeans. So
Mm-hmm.
smallpox outbreak from interaction with Spanish then spreads to another island through people, and then you get just huge swathes of villages and whole islands. A lot of the Amazon, for instance, was full of people at the time. We know now, and it was completely depopulated shortly after the arrival of the Spanish. We have some Spanish accounts of people everywhere, but then by 1700, there's just nothing. And we're sure, and some of the accounts also speak to just finding bodies, but smallpox, measles, all those things. So those waves of disease were real. They weren't exposed to them, so it just hit them all at once.
Mm-hmm.
But then also, just there was uh, no compassion or help
Mm.
from Europeans,
Yeah,
because then they
but
were just trying to enslave them at the same time. It's just like, this multifaceted thing. But they still, as I said, they still exist. And the Caribs, the Kalinago, and in the Caribbean, they did hold out for 150 years on almost all the islands. It wasn't until the mid 1600s do the Windward Islands start to get
okay.
settled.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and St. Lucia, St. Vincent's is very late. The French had some little pockets, but it's not until like 1763 that that the
Mm-hmm.
British move into St. Vincent, and
Mm-hmm.
they're the ones who round up all of the Caribs, quote unquote, right? Who had intermingled with escaped slaves, maroons, and had become what we call Black Caribs, or the Garifuna, which is also, that word is derived from the Galibi. There are different variations, like we call like suffixes of Carafuna, Garif. You could spell it with a K or a G, and you kind of see how
Mm-hmm.
they relate.
Mm-hmm.
But so the British rounded them all up at one point, and in St. Vincent's, and they moved them all to Central America, Honduras, and so the Garifuna people in Honduras and Belize and Guatemala,
Very.
their homeland is St. Vincent, right? They were,
Oh. Oh.
but but it's only, and there are pockets of them in St. Vincent still in like
Okay.
northern
Mm.
Sandy Bay and the northern part of St. Vincent as Amerindian villages, black Garifuna. But then the last holdout also is Dominica,
Dominica.
and ends up being a truce, and they keep a lot of the land. And then the British over time encroach on that land, and they keep taking pieces of it, and so the territory got smaller and smaller. But they still are there today, and it's still now it's called the Kalinago territory. They've changed the name. And in Trinidad there are reserves for Amerindians, and then of course when you get into on the mainland, of course you start to get different groups that have
Mm-hmm.
territories and reserves. But so
Mm-hmm.
they didn't disappear, right? They didn't all
Mm-hmm.
jump off Leapers Hill. So they're still around, and there is a legacy, like I was saying,
Of the words.
of the
Okay.
words and the practices.
This.
And this is something that has been so underexplored. But just like a brief, off the
Mm-hmm.
top of my head, thinking of, well, how we interact with this environment in Grenada today. This is
Mm-hmm.
not Africa, and it's not Europe, and so
Mm-hmm.
and they're different plants and animals, and so the way we interact with those plants and animals, we learn Europeans and Africans learned them from Amerindians. Somehow, some knowledge was transferred. So things like spearfishing is very Amerindian practice. The
Mm-hmm.
way we catch crayfish is Amerindian
Mm-hmm.
practice. The way we cut
Okay.
lambi isn't an old world thing. That's a new world thing. And the way we cut lambi, to get the animal out, you got to cut the top of it. That
Mm-hmm.
is someone learned that from Amerindians.
Okay.
um,
Wow.
I think even the way some of the gardens are constructed, and the sort of mountain gardens that we have out up in the bush.
Mm-hmm.
It does. I mean, they're it's a creolized landscape, right? So there are elements of like the old slave gardens and what we call provision and things. But the way we do it is different, and it really expanded after the Emancipation period.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of the ways Grenadians today garden and interact with the environment, and even thinking about the moon and all these things, I would not be surprised if a lot of this has to do with Amerindian practices, and of course all the words, the foods that we eat, so cocoa and pineapple, potato. These are all things from the New World. It wasn't until uh, Columbus, what we call the Columbian Exchange, this exchange of plants and animals from the old and new world
Mm-hmm.
after European colonization. And like that's when Italians get tomatoes. So there was no tomato sauce before before that. And
Okay.
there was no potatoes in Ireland before that. Potatoes were domesticated in the Andes, but they were around in the Amazon, probably in the Caribbean.
Okay,
And
that's
go ahead.
interesting because we often think about the potato being a European staple that we would have
Mm-hmm.
come into our diet because of the colonization by the Europeans. So
Right.
this provides a different angle that the potato actually came from the Amerindians.
Yeah. I mean, they
Oh,
were big starch eaters too. There's something to be said about sort of
mm-hmm,
our Grenadian diet and too much starch and the provisions, right? But
mm-hmm,
there's something to be said there. But Amerindians did eat a lot of provision, or like starches too. And all these root crops are New World. They were really into arrowroots and some of the yams. There is an Old World yam, but sweet potatoes,
mm-hmm,
they're all domesticated in the New World.
mm-hmm,
Corn, of course,
mm-hmm,
everybody knows. But a lot of I didn't. This is a short list of foods, but
mm-hmm,
guava,
mm-hmm.
uh, pawpaw, and yeah. You could go through any fruit and try to figure out where it's from. Unfortunately, mango is more of an East. I think it's East Indian,
East Indian,
but
yeah. Mm-hmm.
bread nut is breadfruit is East Indian, but bread nuts is New World. So, and
Mm-hmm.
then tobacco, and a lot of the words, so the words we even use to call them are actually Arawakan origin words.
Mm-hmm.
So it's slightly different than the way we say it today, but they're derived from, like potato is derived from an Arawakan word describe the same thing. Same thing with hurricanes and huracan, God, that's the spirit of the storm. Lambie, actually, in Grenada is a unique place. You don't hear that word anywhere else.
Oh, really? Lambi. You mean lambi? The lambi, the preparation of lambi, that's unique.
Yeah, well, and the word itself is the
Okay.
preparation, but the word, and most people call it conch. And that word, though, it seems to be an Arawakan word.
Okay.
So I don't know much more about that, but really interesting. That we still use that, you know. And then there's and of course canoe, barbecue.
Barbecue.
Of course, like, you know, barbecue is a pretty simple practice. People have been doing that throughout time all over the world, but the word barbecue is Arawakan. And then a lot of place names. So there's a few local place names like Camerhone, Bacalet, Caligny, Levera. They seem to be Arawakan words. They might be derived from Carib chiefs, as they were not really chiefs, but I mean we call them chiefs, but they were some sort of leader. Not necessarily that everybody followed everything they said, but they were leaders, and the Europeans seem to name them after that. Same thing with Antoine is another one, and they also gave it. Well, Antoine is a French name that they gave to an Amerindian in that area. Same thing with Marquis, and there's some Duquesne. These are names that they called Carib chiefs in that area, and now we know that place as that name, even though it's a French name. It was originally from what they called, you know, an Amerindian there, and then of course Saltaires is just the event, you know. So it has that heritage there, and then Bahamas, Cuba, Haiti. So I mentioned those modern countries. And so last, I think that's the end. Yeah. So last but not least, so I do these community archaeology projects, and if anybody's interested, it's not as active as I'd like it to be, but it's slowly getting more. We had some funding from UNESCO, and it seems like we're going to get funding for this summer to do more excavations in Saltaires. So if anyone is interested in learning some of the methods in archaeology, we'll do a big program there. There's more information on GrenadaArchaeology.com. I need to add a GPAN page. So I haven't done this yet, but soon there will be on that website. And so there's more information about Grenada archaeology.
Okay. So just about the upcoming potential summer program. So is it geared towards young people? Like who is the... Okay.
Well, yeah. Generally secondary school, like age 15 to 35 or so. I like the kind of middle, like this group actually had a lot of like 20-year-olds in the mid-20s, and that was great. I've dealt with, I mean, because you just can talk, you can get a lot more detail, right? I've done some primary school programs, and I did a program in 2010 when I was a Peace Corps at Queens Park, and it was like grades 4 through Form 2.
Okay.
And it was interesting because those kids showed up every day because their parents would send them. You know, they're like, "Oh, go to this program." Whereas 20-year-olds, you really have to entice them and get them to take their Saturday and to come, instead of Lyman, to come do this thing. So it's a little bit harder, but yeah. But I mean, we would take anybody interested, really.
Interested. Okay. Well, that's good. Yeah, well, thank you very much, Dr. Jonathan Hanna. This was a very informative session. I learned a lot, plus I'm sure the audience too as well would have learned lots about Grenada's archaeology and all the points that you shared. We'll continue to share them here on our Facebook page, but a lot of information. So thank you for joining us on the program today. And we'll just take a short break, and we'll be back for the wrap up. Well, thank you very much. So that's the end of our program today. Thank you for tuning in to another episode of Island Learning Grenada. Hopefully you enjoyed it as much as we did here. And stay tuned for our program next week. If you're following the page on Facebook, share the program. You could still share the program after the live has been completed. And of course, if you're loving our content, follow us on Island Learning Grenada on Facebook. And if you are on YouTube, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, Island Learning Grenada. So see you next week for another episode of Island Learning Grenada. Hope you have a blessed week. Tomorrow, just a plug here, is a very historic day for Grenada. We'll be receiving the first in the set of no, I'm not saying that word correctly. Reparation monies from the traveling family who will be in Grenada for the handing over of those monies to the government of Grenada and the Grenada National Reparations Committee. So do stay tuned to all the local networks to take in that program tomorrow. And of course, next week, we'll talk a little bit more about that event tomorrow. That's happening tomorrow. So stay blessed, have a blessed week, and catch you next week.